Hey, what's up? It is a Finance Friday. I'm Haley Jones with eXp Realty based out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'm here with my awesome friend,
Shea Martin with Mortgage Investors Group.
And today is part 4 of the loan process, not part 8, part 4
Part 8
of the loan process, where we are talking about closing time. If you don't follow me on Instagram, I sing that in every closing. So I'm just telling you, if you want to hear me sing more, go do that. But okay, step 4 is closing. So, Shay, tell us, what do we need to know about closing and our home loan?
Right. So closing is the final step. Basically, after your loan has been approved by underwriting, after you've gone through underwriting and we have your loan approval, now is the time to schedule your closing if you have not already done so. I recommend scheduling your closing pretty early in the process, but now is definitely when we know you are officially good to schedule your closing. We know that your loan is approved. And so it's time to schedule that closing with the title company. We need to know what day, what time. We need to know everything because there are a lot of things that have to happen when we get to the closing time point. And so we need to know exactly when you're closing. So schedule that closing, the earlier the better, but definitely when we have your loan approval, you need to have your closing scheduled.
Yes. So just as a side note, when you make an offer on a house, you put a closing date in that offer. Now, that means that is the day you are working towards close. Now, obviously, if it changes, you have to amend the contract, like you have to do some things. But we know that closing date that we're working towards as soon as we write an offer. So that being said, just because we put a closing date on that offer doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to hit that date. However, that's what we're all working towards from the lending side, from like my side as your real estate agent. The title company is working off that date. And in some cases, some situations, like depending on if a house, if things are contingent on something else selling in another deal, like all of us are kind of working around this one closing date. And so you know that date very like at the beginning of the process, basically.
Right. That's our time frame. That is what we are. And again, we're going to move as fast as possible for you, but the closing date sets certain time frames that certain things have to happen. So that closing date is firm for your contract. Things happen, things change, but everybody needs to be aware if something's going to change. Your lender needs to know if your closing date changes. If you cannot make it if you're out of town on the day that's in your contract, tell your real estate agent. Everybody needs to know if the closing date is changing, and they need to know as soon as possible.
Right. Especially like if you are out of town, just bear in mind that you have to have certain documents a certain amount of time. All of the documents have to be prepared and put in the mail. And so that is, it always makes me anxious. Right. Because I'm like, oh gosh. Okay. So when do we get in this loan process the clear to close? And what exactly does that mean?
Yeah. So the clear to close is a little bit different than the final underwriting approval. It could happen at the same time. It just depends. If you have another house that you are selling, and say you're doing a back-to-back closing and your loan is contingent on you closing on your current house before you can buy a new house, you are not officially clear to close until we have the settlement statement from that first closing. So your loan might be approved, we're basically done, but you're not officially clear to close until we have everything that we possibly need. So the underwriter could ask for some things that need to be in your file that the underwriter doesn't necessarily need to sign off on. It could be an additional addendum or disclosure to the contract. That's not going to make a difference or an issue with your underwriting approval, but it's something that we have to have in our file as the lender. So there are just different things that we have to have, and you're not officially clear to close until we have all of those in the file. That doesn't mean you can't schedule closing. That doesn't mean other things can't happen. That just means you can't close the paperwork on your closing day until we have our complete file, which includes it depends on whatever your file means, but the official clear to close does not happen at that point. But typically we say once your loan is approved by underwriting and we've cleared all the big hurdles, all of that, then again, that's when you want to schedule the closing because we're all working towards that closing date. Other minor little things that we can slide in, that's not going to hold us up for closing.
Awesome. So tell us about the closing disclosure. How far in advance do we need that? What it is, why it's important, and what days count?
Exactly. That's a great question. So the closing, again, I was talking about the closing date. Everybody has to know. We as the lender have to know your closing date because by law, we have to send you your closing disclosure. Your closing disclosure is your final form that discloses to you your final loan terms. It's your final payment. It is your official cash to close with all of your closing costs verified, any credits, if the seller's giving you credits, any tax prorations, all of that has all been verified. And this is all on your closing disclosure form. Back in 2015, a new law went into place that basically said your lender can't be changing your numbers up until an hour before closing. There are little things that can change with your numbers if we find out you've already paid your pest inspection, things like that. So there are things that can change. But basically, this law was instituted when the closing disclosure was created to make sure that people knew their terms well before they got to the closing table. So by law, we as the lender must provide you your closing disclosure 3 days before closing. That is 3 business days prior to closing. You have to open and review and acknowledge receipt of this closing disclosure. We can't just send it to you and say, oh, they should have gotten it, we emailed it. You have to receive it. We have to show that you received this closing disclosure 3 days before closing.
So again, just 3 days before closing, 3 business days, but Saturdays count? Isn't
Correct. So Saturday, because banks are open on Saturdays, Saturday is technically a banking business day. So Saturdays do count. It kind of helps us at the end. It basically gives us an extra day there to make sure that we don't delay your closing. But if you do not open your closing disclosure on the 3rd day before your closing, you cannot close. So your lender is going to be calling you. They're going to be telling you, hey, we sent this, open this up. We're going to go through it with you. We're going to talk about the terms, but the big thing is making sure that you open that and you're responding to your lender, because we don't want to delay your closing date because you didn't open up an email.
Right. And just, I want you to hear those words. You cannot close if you don't have, if you haven't reviewed it or whatever.
Right.
3 days before. So
and the law is 3 days before closing. There are different things, we as a lender, we would love to have your numbers to you 7 days before closing. So there are different things. If we get your numbers to you 2 weeks before closing, there's different things, we can show that you've received it by that point. So there are different things, but that is all part of the loan process. Is we're gearing up to make sure that your loan is done and we can send you your closing disclosure 3 days before closing. So all of this workflow is building up. The big thing, if you don't have it in place by now, you must have your homeowner's insurance in place before we can send you your closing disclosure, because that affects your final numbers. So homeowner's insurance, all of that has to be in place for us to finalize your figures for closing. So the earlier you do everything you need to do to guarantee that we can have those numbers to you, the better.
And on that, like within that closing disclosure, that's when, just to reiterate what you said, is that's when you're going to know like your total numbers. So like, what your payment's going to be. Do you also know when your first payment is on that, or no? Because I know that
specifically state that. Yeah, we talk about that when I call you with your numbers, and there's a form in their closing paperwork that states that.
Your closing for sure will
say
tell
that
you,
on the closing disclosure. So the closing disclosure is about 5 pages. It basically, first page is a snapshot of everything you need to know. The form that was created, the closing disclosure, also matches one of your initial loan disclosures called the loan estimate. They were created, they're the same format so that you can compare the final and the end numbers and make sure that everything is what you expected it to be. So the closing disclosure is a nice, easy to follow format. It has your total cash to close, it has your payment, and then all the subsequent pages break down how we got to that number. Mm-hmm. So all of the breakdown of all of your closing costs with the title fees and all of that good stuff. And then also there's if you're buying and not refinancing, there's a page called the Summaries of Transactions. So it's the sales price of the property. How much are you financing? Were there any seller credits, tax prorations, earnest money? All of that is going to be located on page 3 of the closing disclosure. That really breaks down, again, how we got to that number, where all the credits that you think you should have gotten, all of that will be applied. That's all on page 3 of the closing disclosure.
And then also bear in mind that like the title company and the lender are in cahoots, but not in a bad way, about what those numbers look like. So you're going to also have a statement from the title company that should essentially match what your closing disclosure says. And then just also bear in mind that that closing disclosure from lender kind of comes before that title statement, because
the closing disclosure is the official form that must be signed from the lender at closing. However, part of that has to happen for us to send you your final official numbers is we have to have the title company's fees. So we are working with the title company, verify their their costs, their fees, anything that they've seen from the contractor, heard from the real estate agents. We're all working together to make sure that when we send you that closing disclosure, we hope we don't have to make any changes. We hope everything is final for you, that we've gotten everything verified well before we need to. Again, we can still make changes. There are some things that can change with our numbers. We send this to you so you can review your closing disclosure. If you look through it and say, hey, I already paid that, or hey, I don't see that someone was supposed to give me $1,000 and I don't see that on there, we can make those changes. That doesn't mean that we can't make changes within those 3 days before closing. This just means that we want these in your hands so that you can review and you feel comfortable with your numbers.
Right. And I want to encourage people to like ask questions. So when you get that closing disclosure, if you're still unclear, like on what your payment might be, or like how much you need to bring to closing, like what your check amount needs to be, like if you're still unclear, you don't want to be walking in the morning of like, what am I supposed to be bringing? And then also know that your agent sees the statement from the title company. We don't see the closing disclosure from the lender. So just bear that in mind, that like your resource here is like, I can help you read through that from the statement from the title company. But if you're questioning how much you should be bringing to the table, I can help you as your agent, but your best resource is going to be to go to your lender and ask like, okay, what do I anticipate? Like what you should know 3 days beforehand,
right?
What you need is the
right. And that's again where those 3 days helps, because, previous to 2015, someone could call you an hour before and say, okay, you need $20,000. Well, you can't just scramble and get $20,000.
Good luck.
So having that number 3 days before, I'm going to send it to you in an electronic format for you to review. I'm going to call you. I'm also going to follow up with an email. You're going to know what your number is, but definitely ask questions. Sure. If your bank's not local and you can't get a cashier's check, you need to make arrangements. So these are all conversations we need to have well before the closing day to make sure that we are setting you up for success on that closing day. So you just get to walk in and be happy and not be stressed out.
Right. Exactly.
Other than you have to move, but that's a whole nother thing. I guess that's the fifth step that's not part of the loan process is moving.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. Ooh. And then also like at the closing table, you will sign your piece of paper that says like, this is when your first payment is due, and your closing officer will walk you through like, if it's late, this is what happens, and when would it be late if you don't, and then there's all that information as well. So you're also given that as part of your closing documents from the closing table. And then when we say closing, that is when the house is yours officially. Now, typically that means that day you get the keys and you're moving in. Now, there may be a special situation where you have an occupancy agreement or there's some kind of agreement, but officially when you close, that house is now yours. It is now your property. You own it. Yeah. Because a lot of people are like, well, what does that even mean, closing? No, that means it's yours. So,
right. Yeah. So and that's the other thing I like to mention too, is that the closing, we are your lender, but the closing on the property actually takes place with the title company or at the title company's office, because we prepare all your loan documents, but the title company, the title attorney, the settlement agent, they are the ones who prepare and the deed transfer. So they are actually who transfer the deed into your name. That comes from the title attorney's office. So we provide this is where your money's coming from. This is the loan you're getting, but the title company is where you actually go and sign for closing, because they handle and they record all of the paperwork with the courthouse.
Yes.
There's a lot of people involved in the closing part.
Yeah. Thank the Lord for the title company. Anyways, okay, so that's closing. I mean, we have now, over the past month, we have gone from being under contract to you owning a property, which is so exciting. So if you missed any of these steps, again, it was application, processing, underwriting, and closing. So check those out. But if you have questions, feel free to obviously give us a call, because we would love to chat with you. But I think that's all for the loan process.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you have questions, call us. This is a very basic breakdown of what you can expect to go through. Everybody's going to go through these steps when you get under contract on a house. Or if you're refinancing, the steps are going to be the same. Obviously, there's not a contract and things like that. But if you're refinancing, the steps of the loan process are the same. So these are the general steps that you will go through if you are obtaining a loan. So I just want to kind of break those down for everybody, and definitely reach out if you have any questions about when something might happen or when it needs to happen. That's what we're here for, is any unique situations, things like that. But just so you know what to look out for, now you're out there happy house hunting, but now you won't be so blindsided when you do get under contract.
Right. Exactly. Now you're informed and empowered to make awesome things happen. Okay. I think that's all for this week's Finance Friday. We will see you next Friday. Again, I am Haley Jones with eXp Realty, based out of Knoxville, Tennessee.
And I'm Shea Martin with Mortgage Investors Group, also here in Tennessee.
And we will see you guys next Friday.